Hi, Sue from IC Sugar. One of my most popular cakes over the years has been this Winnie the Pooh. It was my very first hand painted cake that I ever did with a scene. So I sort of figured I might go ahead and try and remake the cake and show you how I did it. So I'm going to do a full tutorial from start to finish, showing you each step of the way. So hopefully you can follow along and make your own cake. Um, I always ice my boards first. Usually they take anything, 24 hours or more to dry. And look, you can even make them early up to a week beforehand if you want to do that. So I pre-kneaded this icing before I started filming. So I'm just actually rolling it out now and moving around to make sure it doesn't stick to the bench. I choose my boards to suit the cake that I'm trying to make. So in this particular tutorial, I wanted a slightly taller board. So I have what's called a drum board here. Um, so most boards are only, I don't know what, few mils thick, but this one is a little taller. Uh, oh, it looks like my icing pin's about to roll off the bench. Never mind. Um, So I'm not measuring my icing out. Obviously, I've got the board there, so I can see roughly the size that I'm going to need, and just smoothing it out now to sort of get the air bubbles out of the icing. So here, just putting a little bit of water onto the board. You can use egg white or you can use cake glue. Doesn't really matter so long as it sticks to the board. We don't need to be overly fussy with the icing. It is, after all, going to have a cake on it, so you're not going to see a lot of the lumps and bumps. Um, the reason I ice a board is it does provide some continuity to the cake, and if you're airbrushing your cake or you're hand painting your cake, you can continue that pattern onto the board. Um, it just looks a lot nicer. So with this icing, you could overlay a pattern if you want to do that, um, or you could trim it. Like with this one, I'm actually going to hang the icing over the sides of the board. Um, the only issue with that is if you're going to transport your cake, it's probably worth thinking about just having the icing that's level with the board because it is prone to chipping and damage. So, but look, I guess it depends. It depends on what you want for your cake. And I mean, if you had your cake sitting on another board, which you often see, um, then of course it's not going to be, yeah, it's going to be less subject to any damage. Just smoothing it out, just wanting to make sure I don't have any major lumps and bumps. There's nothing worse than putting your cake on top of the board and it's sitting uneven because you haven't smoothed your icing out properly. Just smoothing out the sides. In a minute, I will put a little bit more water around the edge just to make sure that it's stuck properly. Um, and Once I've done this, I will set aside this board for 24 hours and then we're going to move on to baking the cake. So I'm going to use, because this is for display only and it's only to show you guys, so it's not going to be an overly big cake. So you can just adapt this to whatever size you want. It's going to be, I'm going to end up using a 7-inch, excuse me. And so here, look, trimming off the icing here. And as I said, if you don't want it hanging over the sides like what I've got, you can trim it out level with the top of the board. So once I've put this aside, I'll then start preparing my cake mix. And in my next tutorial, or the next part of this video, you'll end up seeing um, what size I'm going to bake. And after that, we'll get on to preparing and laying out the scene for Winnie the Pooh and obviously painting it. If you have any questions, please feel free to contact me at any stage and I'm certainly happy to answer them. Okay, so overnight I baked my cakes. I have baked butter cake and used a double height cake pan and a single height cake pan. I always line the inside of my tins with wax paper so the paper comes just over the top of the tin, and this means I can bake to the full height of the cake pan without having to worry that it's actually going to spill out over the top in the oven. I haven't used, you can see I'm just going to trim the cakes down now to the heights that I want. I haven't used a measuring tool to find the center of this cake. I'm just pretty much choosing what I think is the middle. The outside of this cake is going to be a little bit like a tree stump, so I haven't spent a lot of time, or I won't spend a lot of time getting it overly even. Um, if this was a wedding cake, I certainly would spend a lot more time measuring and layering my tiers so everything was 100% flat. Um, Also, when I'm doing a wedding cake, when I ganache, I use a lot more ganache on the outside, and I just spend the time in getting it as smooth as possible. But for this one, not so fussed. Um, you can see now what I've done here is when I cut the cake in half, I actually put the top part of the cake, which is the roughest part, on the bottom. And I think uh, the point to note here is when you do a cake of any sort, that the bottom part of the tin is actually on the top, and this will give you a really level surface to work with. With your chocolate ganache, I hand make my own. I use dark chocolate, Nestle actually, and cream, and I whip it up until it has a slightly glossy look. Unfortunately, with this one, I got a little distracted, and you can see there the ganache has started to set. I let it sit for too long, um, which sort of made putting it on the outside of the cake a little harder than perhaps it would have been normally. To fix this, you can actually just pop it in the microwave just for a couple seconds just to soften it again. I guess the thing is, with cake decorating that I've learned over the years is you're not always going to get it right. You'll have mistakes. The cake decorating is more around just, fixing up your little errors here and there, putting little mistakes to the back of the cake where they can't be seen, and that sort of thing. So you can see here that um, I have softened a little bit of the ganache. I'm just going to pour it over the top at the moment. Unfortunately, because this was a butter cake, the fact that the ganache was probably a little harder than I would have liked has sort of, um, it didn't allow me to sort of smooth it on, and it tended to sort of stick against or pull away some of the crumbs from the side of the butter cake. It was a little bit annoying. Um, I didn't spend a lot of time showing you me ganaching the cake. It's really quite boring. Probably took me about half an hour, but it's just persistent. So you just put your chocolate on and you keep smoothing it down. What I did here is I did heat up the side of my smoother slightly. So rest around under hot water for a little bit. Um, and it just helps to smooth down the side of the cake. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with that. Looking at it close up, it does have a few lumps and bumps, but as I said, I'm going to it's going to be a tree stump, so not going to be too fast. I'm now going to put the cake on its iced board, and you'll see in a minute, I'm just going to flip it upside down. And I have a little bit of melted chocolate that I'll put on the top. Be careful not to put way too much melted chocolate when you put your ice board on. Um, and you squish it together. If you've got too much melted chocolate, it's just going to come seeping out of the sides, which is what you don't want. So just enough chocolate here, just to adhere the board. We're going to turn the board upside down, put it on the top. And I'm just going to roughly find the center of the board just by measuring the distance, between the cake and the edge of the board using my fingers there. Just seeing I've got it roughly center. and just letting it sit for a few secs. Otherwise, if I don't and I flip it over, it's simply just going to slide off. After this, we're going to move on to icing the cake. And following that, we will start our Winnie the Pooh painting. Hi everyone. Um, Unfortunately, after I took my last lot of videos, I went to transfer it over to the computer, and for some reason I've deleted a whole heap of files. So anyway, very frustrating. So I'm just showing you here or recreating some of what I've already done. When I'm designing a picture for front of the cake, I do look for artwork that inspires me. I try not to copy other people's artwork. Exactly, because really that's probably not the nicest thing, but I do use various bits and pieces for inspiration. Um, so I've got a picture here that I like, and in fact, this is the same picture that I used for the first Winnie the Pooh that I did. And but I am going to put a different Winnie the Pooh on this one and just change up the colors a little bit so it's not exactly the same as the last one. I just have taken a sheet of wax paper, and I've cut it to the shape of the icing that I've put on the front of the cake. So I've got sort of roughly the right size. Um, and just really mindful that the picture sort of is all going to fit at the front of the cake, which is sort of nicer for photographic purposes. Just not overly complicated. I'm not really going to be very fussed about drawing everything. I'm really just trying to get the key elements onto the paper. Um, and the phone's pretty handy. I've just sort of got Winnie the Pooh to the size that I want. Oh, well, lost it there for a sec. Anyway, to the size that I want, and I will trace over that. When I finish this, what I then did is cut the Winnie the Pooh out, and I put the wax paper up against the side of the cake. I pinned out some key elements, cut the Winnie the Pooh out, and drew around it slightly where I wanted it to sit on the cake. Uh, Just it's really just to give me perspective and to make sure that I've got everything in the right spot. So again, this applies to pretty much any type of cake you're going to want to do. Um, just make sure you've got everything in perspective. You can see here that's as complicated as my drawing gets. If you look closely here, you'll see the outline of the Winnie the Pooh, and you'll also see that I didn't ice the sides of the cake. I know I said previously I was going to, but I changed my mind. I figured it's going to be easy to paint first and then ice around it, and cover up any of the sides of the painting that I might not like. So um, when I make a cake, I don't always have a preconceived idea of how I'm going to do it, and sometimes I just wing it, um, and just sort of work with it. And sometimes I have an idea and I get halfway through it and I decide I don't like it, so I change it and I do something else. Um, with the figurines and painting, it's not something that I've been doing for a really long time. I've sort of found my way. Originally, when I started painting, I was mixing the color with water, and found that the next day that the icing had somewhat absorbed the paint and I had lost a lot of the color. Um, and that has to do with using water. So I suppose if you're going to start painting, the very first thing I suggest is never, ever, ever use water, or never mix it in with your paints. So I've used vodka here, and you'll see on the side of the screen I've just put up the colors. Um, so if you did want to copy Winnie the Pooh, feel free to purchase these colors if you don't have them already. Alternatively, you can mix up your own. Um, when I first started painting, I really just bought the primary colors, so your red, blue, yellow, etc. Um, and I would just sort of mix the tones to suit. So that's probably if you're on a budget, that's probably a good way to do it. Um, or you can buy some pre-mixed colors, whatever works for you. I realized by watching myself paint which is sort of interesting. Um, I tend to sketch the outline first. I'm not really, don't go in like having it perfect, having the outline perfect. I tend to like to feel my way. And what you can see that I did there is I've sort of gone outside roughly where I think it should be, and I dampened it with a little bit of vodka, and patted it with some um, paper towel just to sort of lift it off the icing. So the other thing that's really interesting is I struggled when I first started painting with white, because if you're doing an oil painting or something like that, you can sort of layer white over the top. Um, with sugar paste or with food color, if you layer white over the top, it sort of tends to be absorbed somewhat into the color underneath. So it does lighten the tones, but I sort of found personally that the areas that I like to be white, I actually paint last. Um, but I do mix the white in with the various colors, and I use it for shading. So that works really well for me. Um, but of course, for anyone who's painting, I'm sure you're going to find your own way and what sort of works for you. So I'm here. I'm just sort of finding again my outline, and I'm just putting in some tones and some shading. Um, and often I tend to change it up a little bit. So if it's not looking right, I'll add a little bit more color and play around with it. Sort of really doesn't need to be perfect. So I guess maybe that's the thing with painting. You can change it if you don't like it. Like um, if you haven't got the colors in the right place, that's no problem. Just paint over it. It's no big deal. Um, and I tend to do this a lot. So and in fact, like with this, it's actually sped up a fair bit. But I think it probably took me a couple of hours to paint it. And in the video, it's probably 10 minutes. And I've taken out all the little bits and pieces where I've sort of been dipping my paintbrush in the paint and mixing it and all that sort of stuff, because I'm sure you guys don't really want to see that. Um, so yeah, so look, here we are. So just shading a little bit now. You can see that I've got sort of the shape of the face. Sort of played around with it a little bit just to get the shape sort of right. And putting in the ears. So I typically use gel paste. I find it sort of, yeah, it's sort of quite good. On occasion, if I'm wanting a really, really vibrant color, you can get fluoro gel paste. And if I wanted something a little bit more liquidy, so perhaps if I'm doing a something more along the lines of a watercolor look, I will use airbrush color, because that's really it's quite vibrant. And yeah, so I guess it's just really a case of just mixing it up, just seeing what works for you, and giving it a shot. I sometimes, if I'm using airbrush color, I'll put in some white um, powder, and that sort of helps thicken it a little bit. Add a little bit of vodka to it. Again, I just sort of play around to get the tones that I want. I've used a couple different brushes here, so I like sort of a reasonably flat brush. I also have a couple of really fine brushes just to sort of get the detail that I need. But again, guys, don't, just give it a shot. Like I said, pin out your outline, get it roughly where you want it to be. Do do roughly what the shape is going to be, um, and then just start filling in a bit of shading. So the shading is just a little bit of brown that I've added to the main colors that I've used. So still the same base colors, just add a little bit of brown to, and oh, here we go. I'm just doing to the black for the mouth now. Um, but just fill it in, and then just don't forget your shading. So if you're going to copy a picture, have a look where the shading is. It's always like under the arms, or at the back, or under the neck. So you can get a really good look just by remembering just to put a bit of that in. So just adding a little bit of black here and just finalizing Winnie the Pooh with just his little eyebrows. So now moving on to the background. So I found over the time with the various paintings that I've done, I always paint the characters first. So the thing with food color or painting with food color, it's really, really hard to paint over something and it tends to absorb the color of what's behind it. So if you're wanting really vibrant characters, I paint them first and then I paint my background around them. Um, Again, if you're working like with acrylics or oil paint, you paint over the top, but I find that concept doesn't work so well for cakes. With the sky, again, you're working with food color. It's a little bit hard to blend. So I've just sort of put the colors that I've wanted and brushed over them with a slightly larger brush just to blend it all together. Um, for the base here, so around his legs, obviously I've just used a little bit of brown, and again, I'm just sort of highlighting with a little bit of white just to give a little bit of give some shade. I have a few different brushes that I use. Some are newer and some are older. I quite like the older ones. They can add some nice texture. So, if you're wanting sort of to do some leaves or you're wanting to do some grass and you've got sort of some older brushes, they sort of create some nice, some nice textures. So you can see now what I've done is I'm just bringing in the colors that I'm wanting. Later on, you'll see I've taken some of the purple off because I actually didn't like it. It went down too far. So um, below that ends up being green. So I just removed some of it. So again, this is the thing with painting. You don't really need to be, doesn't need to be perfect. You can play around with it. You can remove it if you don't like it. So if you want to take it off, as I said before, get a clean brush, a little bit of vodka, wipe it over, um, and just use your paper towel to take it off. So no big deal. Yeah. So again here, just toning and playing around with it. Yeah. So you can see here that I've taken off a lot of the purple. Just really wasn't doing it for me. So the whole thing with painting is just playing around with your color, getting the tones you like. If it's not perfect, it's no big deal. You can take it off. You can go over it. Well, go over it's hard, but um, you can change the tones up a little bit. I guess the main thing is probably to start with a plan. Um, I know that a lot of people will draw the whole picture out first. I sort of don't like to do that. I sort of tend to work with it as I go. It sort of works for me. So I'm doing the background here, and with if you're doing anything in the background, it's obviously going to be less what's the word for it? Less vibrant. It sort of tends to blend into the background. It's not very detailed. So I've just mixed food color here with some vodka. So it's a little bit liquidy and just building up the light to the dark tones. It just really needs to give the impression that it's grass or a background. Um, we're not doing anything particular. We're not doing leaves or trees or anything at this stage. And you can see here, I'm just going around Winnie the Pooh. I have quickened this video up a little bit because making the cake took me about 8 hours. So um, really sure you didn't want to watch an 8-hour video. But I just got out my really, really fine brush just to go around his head and just trying to make sure I'm staying within the lines, so not ruining my character. Sorry, I just had a pop-up come up on the screen, something reminding me to do something, so just had to click that off. So this is sort of the tree line, and you can see that I've sort of cut a little bit out there, because it ended up that my hand was in front of the whole picture, which obviously is not really good to look at. So sorry about, here we go, it's my hand again. Anyway, so just used one of my really old brushes just to do that tree line, and just brushed the color up to blend it a little bit into the background. So with the tree, I've used woodland brown, um, and I've just blocked it in first, so just really getting the shape and where I want the tree to look, just running the branches out. I actually haven't copied this from anything. The tree, that is. I didn't really have a preconceived idea of where I wanted the tree to sit. Um, Again, I've sort of just blocked it in, drawn it into the space that I've wanted, and done my little branches. With Winnie the Pooh, it's not an overly complicated background or scenery. It's very characterized, it's very simple. So the trees are not overly complicated. I haven't really gone into a lot of shading. But you'll see later on in the close-ups, there is some black through the trees, and I have created a little bit of light and shade in there. Um, when you're painting trees, or when you're painting any scenery, it's a really good idea to sort of work out where your light's coming from. So um, with this particular one, it sort of ends up being slightly darker on the outside, and the light sort of is coming through the middle. So if you're highlighting any parts of your tree, have a think about that, and perhaps highlight the areas that would normally light up if you're looking at it in nature. So in this case, it's on the insides of the trees. Um, so when I did my first trees, they were really disastrous, and my leaves were all over the place. I tried to do my dark colors first and then light over the top. And as I said before, um, that's really, really hard to do with food color. So it really was, it was a really bad effort actually. So what I do now is I start at the very ends with the light, um, and I go and I uh, darken the leaf look as I go in closer to the trunk. So if you look at a tree in nature, the darker parts of the tree are the ones closest to your branches, the ones on the inside of the foliage, and the light reflects on the outside. So I did actually go over the leaves with a little bit of my white. As I said, it doesn't make it white, it does blend in, but it does highlight. So again, light on the outside, work your way darker into the middle, leave some spaces in there if you want a little bit of the background to come through. Again, I've used an old brush here, and all I'm doing is just putting on some darker color and pulling it upward in strokes. Now, if you're going to paint um, grass, then paint it perhaps in sort of like a wavy, like grass doesn't go up straight. Grass is curved usually. So paint like you paint like in a curve. So here I'm just putting in a little bit of texture, and I just put in some little dots to create some flowers. Okay, so now we're actually moving on to icing the outside of the cake. So I have a texture mat that I quite like. You could, if you don't have a texture mat, you can sort of create a similar effect just by using a knife and just drawing the lines into the fondant. Um, as I said in previous videos, I don't use a lot of texture mats and I don't use a lot of tools. I have some basic ones that I like. Um, and this texture mat is quite good. I do use it for a number of different uh, tree effects that I've done on cakes in the past. So this is not hard. All I did was wetten the background with a little bit of water just to make sure the fondant sticks to my chocolate ganache underneath. Okay, so what I'm showing you there is the joins, and I pressed just some of the texture mat back into the joins to actually conceal the joins between the three pieces of fondant I put on. So this is the bit that I accidentally lost earlier. Um, I filmed making the top of this cake, but yeah, unfortunately, that was the, the part that I deleted accidentally. So I'm just airbrushing, and as you can see, I've just sort of done some rings to reflect what the inside of a tree would look like, um, and I tend to go over it with an airbrush a few times. Spray it over, wetten it down, wipe it off, and the color that's remaining fills the grooves that you've actually created in the fondant. So sometimes I'll go over, and you'll see on the side of this cake, sometimes I'll go over the fondant 2 or 3 times. So I'll airbrush um, and wipe it off, airbrush, wipe it off, and I will do that a few times until I get the color and tones I want and the effect that I want. If you don't have an airbrush, here we go, you'll see this here in a minute on the side. If you don't have an airbrush, no problem. You can actually just take a good size paintbrush um, and you can paint your food color directly onto the fondant and just follow this same um, yeah, just follow this same technique. So brush it on, use some, you can use a little bit of water if you want on some paper towel, which is what I use. Rub it off. It fills the indentations and just keep going over it until you've got the tone and the colors that you like. If you want quite a light colored cake, well, just do it maybe once or twice, but I've done it 3 times. I did get a whole heap of airbrush color on the board. Um, wasn't particularly worried about it because as you can see in this picture here, I just airbrushed over it in dark green. So, and brown. So if you want to do that, that's fine. You can, you just end up painting over it anyway. So don't be sort of too fussy about the color you have on your board. Just using a small piping tube here, a leaf tube. It's just a tiny leaf tube and some green royal icing, which is just egg white and icing sugar. So it's just really some basic leaf piping around the sides of the cake, and I do that also up the side of the cake. And what I then do to finish the cake is I have 5 butterflies that I put on the top, rice paper butterflies, and I just go through and just dot on some really fine royal icing flowers. So not really flowers, they're really just dots more or less, but just to create the effect that there's flowers around the cake. And you'll see that in a minute. I did the board a couple of times. I did it in a light green, decided I didn't like it, um, sprayed over it again, didn't like it again, and found that I sprayed over it the third time to sort of darken it up a little bit more. Okay, so here we are. Um, I'd really be interested if anyone has tried to recreate this. I'd really love to see how you went, and I would love some feedback. That would be great. And I hope you found it helpful. Um, and I'm hoping that I have many more that I can put together for you in the future.